Well, hello Mr. Cosmos, I've been expecting you. I'm Leo Warder for Kit Guru. This is the Cooler Master Cosmos C700P case, 22 kilos of EATX, well, everything pretty much. It's a large case, big and heavy, supports a massive motherboard, loads of cooling options. You can put up to a 420 radiator in the front if you pretty much gut it. But other than that, 360, you can put a 360 in the roof. You can have a radiator in the floor. If you add an extra bracket, you can put a radiator at the rear. You get two 140mm front fans. You get a 140 rear fan. There's a clever module that controls the lighting and the fans. And it also supports a reversed motherboard setup. So you can essentially flip the entire thing over and make it upside down on the other side, which is very clever. So on that side, we've got a glass panel, which is two pieces of tempered glass. And this side, we have a solid door. And you can essentially dismantle the chassis, flip it over, reverse the doors, and bingo. We've seen a similar concept with the Be Quiet Dark-Base 900 Pro, which was a very impressive case. Happily, Cooler Master and Be Quiet are not going down the same avenue, in that Be Quiet's kind of plasticky but noise deadening, hence the Be Quiet name, loads of noise deadening material and a clever approach. This is, as you can see, kind of bling in the aluminium and glass side of things, but it's not actually as aluminium-y as it first appears. There's actually quite a lot of plastic going here on a core steel chassis, and they've kind of clad it in all sorts of panels. It looks like it's an awful lot of aluminium. Actually, not so much. Doesn't matter. That's absolutely fine. If you can't tell from this distance what the material is, frankly, who cares? And if you get down to running a magnet over different parts and tapping them, well, they've done the job, haven't they? So that's one of those things. If you're looking for a Lian Li-esque aluminium chassis, this is not going to be the one for you. But other than that, we've got a long list of features to look at. Stripping the chassis down so I can flip over the motherboard tray took about 15 minutes to get to this stage. Taking off the front panel just to show the front fans took moments. There's 6 more screws, 3 on each side, and off it comes. That's all plastic, by the by. And so now you can see exactly how it all works. Internally, it looks very much like one of the Master Case range, which is no great surprise. For example, the drive bays, entirely familiar. 2 sleds, you can move them to any position you want or take the whole assembly out. You can do pretty much what you like. The bare chassis, it's absolutely peppered with threaded holes for the mounting screws, so any component can go in any position, which is a good thing. If you want to put a Mega 420 radiator in the front, you have to lose the optical drive bay, which is up there. Similarly, if you want to put a 360 radiator in the roof, you have to do the same off the optical drive bay. So if you want to keep an optical drive bay, that makes a big difference to your build. You may not, of course, want to put an optical drive in the optical drive bay. Maybe you want to use some monitoring hardware, which goes in one of those bays. But nonetheless, there are many options remaining. Construction is perfectly solid. Dismantling it was not difficult, although the user guide is not the greatest. It's quite small. It's not even IKEA-esque. That would be unfair. There are diagrams showing what you have to do. You have to take out a bunch of screws, but precisely what comes out, it's not absolutely crystal clear. And the thing that makes it slightly confusing is, quite clearly, the hardware's been assembled and then the cables have been threaded into place. And the thing is, there are a lot of cables going to the fan lighting control unit, which is perfectly reasonable, and there are, after all, 3 fans installed. The snag is that you're dismantling the rear panel entirely, which includes one of the fans, so clearly the cable for that has to be sort of routed through and removed, and the cables for the front fans go through the drive cage system, which means you have to unroute those as well, if unrouting is a word. So that's a little bit fiddly, and there's loads of twisty ties you have to remove to get to that stage. So the actual removing screws and pulling things off, that's not the end of the world, but it does have a degree of fiddle about it. Anyway, can't particularly complain. The system works perfectly well. The next question is how easy or otherwise it is to build a system into this Mega Cosmos case. Thanks to the wonders of video editing, you know this is later. I can assure you it is considerably later because this build was difficult. Lots of little bitty things that just conspired to be meh. For example, this here. That panel doesn't meet that panel, and that's annoying. And that's one of the many little things I've come across, which all seem to come back to the point of, if you flip over the motherboard, if you change the handedness of the system, it causes various problems. The problem is, if you don't flip it over. If you just use the case in a conventional way, you're not getting a good bunch of the features of the system, and that's aggravating. Also, I have to apologize to the sensitive viewer, because you will note that the graphics card now being upside down just looks silly. That, of course, is inherent to flipping the system over, unless, of course, you use a liquid-cooled graphics card, such as this GTX 1080 with alpha cooler on it, which is just block of aluminium, or indeed this GTX 980 with an EKWB clear block on it. Either of those upside down looks perfectly acceptable. This stock GTX 1080 does not, and that's all I can say. So if you're using an air-cooled build, it's not great. And the thing is, even with the dark glass panel on, you can still see that lettering clear as day, and that's going to annoy a great many Kit Guru viewers and readers, because that's the type of people that Kit Guru gets. People are interested in detail. We can step back before I get into the detail. If you look at the lighting controls on the top panel, you can set the thing to go through sort of breathe, off, static, flash and such, like all the usual stuff, or you can sync it to the motherboard if you have an RGB header. This ASRock X399 Tai Chi motherboard does have such a header, so it's all synced together and it's just breathing on this sort of mauvish, sort of pinkish colour. So the lights, you've got an underglow and you've got the lights in the top, and then they're synced to the motherboard. These come with the case, this comes with the ASRock. When I turned the system on, there were two other people in the room with me, and the teenager said, "Wow, cool," and the adult said, "Oh dear." So are you an adult or are you a teenager? That, I think, is going to drive your initial impression of the case, and you'll probably just go from there, and then the rest of it's just going to be detail. If it's "oh dear," then there's no real hope, is there? And if it's "wow," well, what do you need to hear from me? Anyway, flipping over the hardware, as I said when I stripped the case down, it felt to me as though the manual had been written to do with the hardware and the cabling had been ignored. When I flipped the components and put it back together, that felt more and more the case. Because the lighting and fan control unit, which is attached to an SSD sled, the cables didn't reach. The cable from the lights in the bottom didn't want to reach to the new position, which of course is across the case and behind the motherboard tray. So I took the control unit out of the sled and I put it in a conventional SSD mount where it does fit. The thing is, that's not a massively difficult job, although I was slightly concerned that the unit might short or something. It didn't. It's got an insulating piece of plastic. But the manual made no mention of this, and I hate to suggest this, but it seems to me, I have to wonder if someone at Cooler Master actually flipped the innards and then did a build and just checked everything fitted. There's a part of me that wonders if they did, and if they did, how did they miss that, or why didn't they make a mention in the manual? One of those things. So it's all gone back together, and that panel there doesn't close correctly, and there's a missing screw, and there's a few other little bits and pieces like that, because when you take out all the insides and just leave the frame as you saw earlier, it becomes flexible. I mean, that's the nature of these things. And then you put components back in place, and I can guarantee I'm putting them back in a different sequence to where the case was first built in the factory, and it just feels like it's slightly out of true. Only very slightly, but enough that things don't quite fit. So that's an annoyance. But that's because I flipped the case. If you use it in the conventional way, then you're dwelling on the fan light control unit and all these cable covers, the fact you can see the motherboard, plus this slight annoyance here, and you can see the hoses to the 240 liquid cooler at the front. Now, I've removed the stock Cooler Master fans, the two 140s, and I've replaced them with the two 120s on the fractal cooler, because by the time I got to a certain stage of this build, I wanted an easy life. And that ASRock X399 Tai Chi is supporting a 16-core Threadripper 1950X processor. I know that fractal cooler, although it looks a bit small for the job, does a perfectly decent job. We've also got an EVGA GTX 1080 Ti, obviously air-cooled as you can see from the lights. We've got some G-Skill FlareX memory, which is specific to Threadripper. Basically, it's two of their FlareX Ryzen kits as far as I can see. Very nice job it does too. There's an SSD in there somewhere, and then up in the top, because it's flipped, we've got a Cooler Master Masterwatt 1200 power supply. And that's all jolly good. In terms of the hardware and such, like, more than happy. But if I hadn't flipped the case, I wouldn't be using most of the features of the case. So I've flipped it and I've annoyed myself, and I can't really reconcile those 2 points. My thoughts about this case are essentially inside it's got an awful lot to do with the master case concept. They actually refer in this paperwork to the master concept 2.0, which I guess is an evolution of master case. In terms of cosmosness, we've got the aluminium rails top and bottom. Other than that, however, it's a zip and zing master case as far as I'm concerned. The fan and lighting control unit is okay, but it's a step behind the times. It works perfectly acceptably, but the idea that the fan control unit has high and low and that's your lot is just ludicrous to my mind. We want something more subtle than that. I think Cooler Master would do well to step back and take a look at the Corsair Commander Pro unit that was recently released, which is controlled by their Link software, and it has all sorts of functions, including full lighting control. That does a really good job. Cooler Master doesn't have their own software. You've got hardware functions, or you can use the motherboard lighting software if you have a motherboard with an RGB header. And that works perfectly acceptably. I can understand why Cooler Master doesn't want to get into software for this sort of thing. It strikes me that if they're going to go down this route, they really need to step up and do that. As things stand, that control unit looks like it's going to do a really good job, and then it falls shy. In the same way as the cable's not reaching the new location, falls shy. Slightly annoying. The cable shrouds both front and rear, and also the drive covers, the way they keep most of the hardware out of sight, so you just see the main features. We've seen cases from the likes of NZXT that manage to just hide cables behind a sort of a little cable shroud, and they can do a perfectly good job. You tuck a couple of drives away and such like, and that does enough. This is over the top to my mind. I haven't got a problem with that, but what it does mean that if you want to get in to change a drive or to move a cable or to do anything, you have to start pulling covers off, you have to unscrew things, and that seems unnecessary. That seems over the top. Not the end of the world. After all, how many times do you go in and change a drive in it? Not very often. I mean, obviously not. But nonetheless, if you want to do anything in this PC, first you have to take off one panel or the other, which actually also generally involves pulling off this back cover here, this thing here. That gives you access to the two side panels. You can take those off, you can go in and you can take off one of the inner panels. A little bit fiddly, more fiddly than you would like. Once you're inside, you're good, then you can do whatever you need to do your maintenance, change some parts or some such, and that's all fine. But it's the extra steps, and I find them aggravating. Instead of dwelling on that sort of annoyance, on the other hand, the sort of thing that won't affect many people once the system's up and running, we can look at something that is more fundamental, that makes me question the overall design of this case. When you're building your system, you have to remove some of the PCI Express expansion card slot covers. You know, you're going to put at least a graphics card in this system, possibly just those two covers, maybe nothing else. Getting to the screws is really awkward because they're completely in line with the side of the chassis, absolutely blocked in the flipped orientation. I used this humongous screwdriver to go at an angle to get the screws out. Otherwise, it was just impossible. And that's the sort of thing that, to me, simply should not happen in a case whatsoever. Whoever's designed the thing should build a system, and they'll come across those sorts of faults, they'll correct them, it'll never happen again. That's in any case, a 50 quid case. In a £250 case, it's entirely unacceptable. It's not a big deal. I could get round it, but it's something that shouldn't happen. For that matter, I'd rather like it if there weren't any screws in those covers whatsoever. If there's just like a lock-in cover or some such. You know, Lian Li did this years ago. Put the thing in, bang, latch, done, next. Instead of which, this is the wrong way around. This is conventional and difficult, and that's just silly. So that's a series of tiddly little points that add up to annoy me because they ended up taking me an awful lot of time. On the plus side, the case looks good. It's reasonably well built, although, as I say, things like that strike me as wrong. The I/O panel, and I haven't mentioned this to this point, is very good indeed. You've got two USB 3 headers on the motherboard, so that's 4 ports in total, and a USB 3.1 Type-C. This board doesn't actually have the correct connection for that header, I was surprised to see. So that's a look to the future, that's a good thing. Forget USB 2, we've moved on a pace. absolutely fine. I mean, I'm not going to buy a case purely for that, but doubtless somebody is, and that's welcome. But nonetheless, that's obviously a niche interest. But overall, this has been an uphill struggle. The initial impact of this case, visually, very good. Pulling it apart, going inside was like, yeah, that's okay. And then it's been a grind. Had I built a conventional PC, non-flipped, I'm sure I'd have a different view. But if you're doing that, it's a hellish expensive case and you're not getting all the features that you might want. If you flip it, you've got a battle on your hands, is my opinion. Also, in terms of the graphics card, you really do need to put a custom loop in it. It's not required from the point of view of cooling, it's required to make it look right. So in that sense, my bad, terribly sorry. I'll do better next time. If you like this video, thumbs up. If you don't, thumbs down. If you want more from Kit Guru, click to subscribe. I'm Leo Walder for Kit Guru. This is the Cooler Master Cosmos C700P.